Hey there, welcome to Broaderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The Sinister Photographer. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you, even when you were alone? That unnerving sensation that someone's eyes are fixed on you, but you can't pinpoint where it's coming from? I never used to believe in things like that. I used to laugh it off. But now, after everything that's happened, I wish I had listened to my gut. I wish I had known that feeling was real. It all started with a news report. They were talking about another disappearance in our city, which had become a disturbingly regular occurrence. I was at home, scrolling through my phone, half listening to the news anchor list off the details. A man in his 30s. No known enemies. Disappeared 2 days ago. His belongings were found undisturbed in his apartment. It could have been anyone, and yet, it felt personal this time. Maybe it was the coldness in the reporter's voice or the picture of the missing man they flashed on the screen. His face seemed familiar, but I couldn't place it. That evening, something changed in the air around me. I was sitting in my living room, alone, surrounded by the quiet of the night, when I started to feel it, the sense that I wasn't really alone. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia. It's easy to get spooked when the media is constantly feeding you stories of missing people, right? But it didn't stop. I began to notice strange things. Photos of people I knew well, even those who I hadn't seen in years, were showing up on my phone, pictures I hadn't taken. They were just there, in my gallery, like they had been taken without my knowledge. What made it worse was that the people in the photos, some of them had recently gone missing. I kept trying to brush it off as a glitch, but my hands trembled while I swiped through the images. The more I looked at them, the more I realized they weren't ordinary pictures. Something was wrong with the photos. In each of them, if you looked closely enough, there was a faint blur in the background, a shadow that seemed to take on a vague shape. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you knew what you were looking for. But once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. This shadow, this shape, it was there in every photo, hovering just behind the missing person. I didn't want to believe it was real. I mean, why would anyone? There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was a coincidence, or some creepy prank someone was pulling on me. But my instincts screamed that something much darker was happening. I decided to talk to my friend Mark. He was a photographer, someone who might understand if it was just a camera trick or something else. When I showed him the photos, his face went pale. He didn't say much at first, just stared at the images with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and strained. "You need to get rid of these," he said. "Delete them all. Don't keep any copies." His reaction freaked me out. "Why?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just trust me. This isn't normal." He paused, swallowing hard before he added, "I've seen something like this before." That's when I realized he was serious. Mark wasn't the type to get spooked easily. He was calm, logical, always finding rational explanations for everything. But now, he was rattled. "What do you mean, you've seen this before?" I pressed. Mark didn't want to talk about it, but eventually he caved. He told me about a client he had a few years back. The guy was obsessed with old cameras and asked Mark to develop some film for him. When Mark processed the photos, they looked normal at first, just regular portraits. But later, when he took a second look, he saw something in the background, those same indistinct shapes. The man vanished a few weeks later. Mark didn't think much of it at the time, figured the guy had moved on or was traveling. But now, seeing the same thing in my photos, it was all coming back to him. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that maybe those shapes weren't just on the photos, they were closer than I wanted to believe. Mark insisted that I delete the photos immediately. He even offered to do it for me. But I hesitated. It was more than just curiosity keeping me from getting rid of them. I felt like these images were a warning. A piece of a puzzle I wasn't meant to solve. I took a deep breath and told Mark I'd take care of it myself. He left, reluctantly, reminding me again to get rid of them. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I kept looking at them, studying each face and each shadowy blur. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized I was too afraid to close my eyes. Every time I did, I saw that shape, that creeping figure, like it was drawing closer, feeding off my fear. And then the dream started. The first one was vivid. I was standing in a room, facing a mirror. In the reflection, I saw myself, but something was off. There was someone behind me, a shadow, a figure I couldn't quite make out. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the shadow was still there, closer now, almost touching me. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. It was just a dream, I told myself. But when I checked my phone the next morning, there was a new photo in my gallery. It was of me, taken while I was sleeping. I stared at the photo on my phone, my pulse racing. There was no way anyone could have taken that picture. I was alone in my apartment the entire night, the door locked, windows closed. My first instinct was to call Mark, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the creeping dread that this was beyond anything he could help with. Or maybe it was the figure in the background of the photo, closer now, almost blending with the darkness behind my bed. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the image. Whoever, or whatever, was taking these photos had been in my room while I slept. I felt violated, exposed. A surge of panic washed over me, and my hand shook as I hit the delete button. The photo vanished from my screen, but the fear remained. I needed answers. Desperately. I couldn't go to the police. What would I even say? That someone was taking pictures of me in my sleep, but I had no idea how. That there was a shadowy figure that seemed to follow people before they disappeared. No, they'd think I was insane. But someone had to know something about this. Someone had to have seen it before. I spent the next few days researching, digging through forums, articles, anything I could find about strange photos, shadows, and disappearances. It felt like chasing a ghost. There were whispers online, stories of people vanishing without a trace, and mentions of strange figures appearing in photographs, but nothing concrete. Just speculation, urban legends that blurred the line between reality and fiction. Then, I found something. Buried deep in an old thread on a paranormal website was a post from someone describing exactly what I was experiencing. The post was dated several years back, and the user had described finding photos in a gallery of friends who had gone missing, each one featuring the same faint, blurry figure in the background. My stomach twisted as I read through the replies. Most people dismissed it as a hoax, but one comment stood out. The photographer only shows up when you're already marked. Once you see him, it's too late. He watches, waits, deletes the photos if you want, but that won't stop him. The words sent a chill down my spine. I felt sick. Could this really be happening to me? Was I marked? I slammed my laptop shut and tried to breathe. No, this couldn't be real. It was some internet prank, a story to scare people. But deep down, I knew better. The feeling of being watched was constant now, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards made my skin crawl. I kept glancing at my phone, expecting another photo to appear, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence of my apartment. By morning, exhaustion had taken its toll, but I knew I couldn't stay in my apartment any longer. I needed to get out, clear my head, put some distance between myself and whatever this was. So, I grabbed my jacket and headed for a walk. The cool air helped a little, the noise of the city a welcome distraction from the growing paranoia that had taken root in my mind. As I walked through the streets, I caught myself glancing at reflections in shop windows, checking behind me every few steps. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. But whenever I turned to look, there was no one there. Still, that presence lingered, just out of sight, watching. I found myself wandering to the edge of the city, where the streets grew quieter, more isolated. It wasn't until I passed an old, dilapidated building that something caught my attention. In the dusty window of a long-abandoned photography studio, a series of old black and white photographs were still on display. The images were faded, the people in them smiling unaware, but something about them gave me a deep sense of unease. I stopped, staring at the photos, and my heart nearly stopped. There, in the background of one of the pictures, was a shape. A blur. Just like in my photos. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced. Was this place connected to what was happening to me? I had to know. I pushed the door open, it creaked loudly, as if it hadn't been touched in years, and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, the smell of decay and time heavy in the small space. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old camera equipment and forgotten film canisters. I moved slowly through the studio, my eyes scanning the room for anything that might explain what was going on. That's when I saw it, a stack of old photographs, scattered across a table in the corner. My hands shook as I picked one up. It was another picture of a person, someone I didn't recognize. But there, in the background, was that same shadowy figure, slightly clearer this time, as if it was stepping out of the darkness. I picked up another photo, and another. Every single one had the figure. And every single person in the photos looked eerily familiar. I couldn't place them all, but I knew I'd seen some of their faces before, on the news. These were the people who had gone missing. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that the figure wasn't just following them. It was choosing them. I dropped the photos and backed away, my mind racing. Whoever, or whatever, the photographer was, he was real. And I was next. As I hurried out of the building, I knew that I couldn't stay silent anymore. I had to tell someone, had to warn them. But the question was, who would believe me? By the time I got home, my mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The city streets, once comforting in their familiarity, now seemed threatening. Every stranger's face blurred into one indistinct figure, every shadow that flickered past a streetlight made me flinch. I kept replaying the moment at the photography studio, seeing those faces, knowing that each one of them had disappeared. And now, I was holding their secret in my trembling hands. I shut the door behind me, locking it quickly, as if that could somehow keep the photographer out. My apartment felt smaller, the walls pressing in as I paced back and forth, trying to make sense of everything. The words from the forum post echoed in my head. Once you see him, it's too late. Was it too late for me? There was only one thing left to do. I had to confront the fear head on, no matter how much it scared me. I needed to look at those photos again. All of them. I sat down, unlocked my phone, and opened the gallery. My finger hovered over the album, my stomach twisting with dread. I hesitated for a moment, then clicked on it. The pictures loaded slowly, almost as if the phone itself was resisting, not wanting to reveal whatever was lurking in those images. There they were, the familiar faces of people who had vanished, each frozen in time, unaware of their fate. As I swiped through the photos, my breathing quickened. In each one, the blurry figure was growing clearer, more defined. But it wasn't until I reached the last photo, the one of me sleeping, that I realized just how close the photographer had come. This time, the figure wasn't just a blur in the background. It was standing beside my bed. I dropped the phone, a wave of nausea hitting me as I recoiled from the image. The figure, it was human-like, but wrong. Its features were indistinct, like a smudge across reality, as if it didn't belong in the world I knew. Its face, if it could even be called that, was just a shadowy mass with no discernible features. But the eyes, or what I assumed were eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness, piercing through the image, staring directly at me. I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering in my chest. I needed to get out. I couldn't stay here. Not with the knowledge that this thing had been standing beside me while I slept. But where could I go? Who could I turn to? Mark. He was the only one who knew about this. The only one who might understand. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to find his number. When he finally picked up, his voice was groggy. He must have been asleep. "Mark, it's me," I blurted out, barely able to control the tremor in my voice. "I need to see you. Now." There was a long pause on the other end, and for a second, I feared he wouldn't respond. Then, his voice came, heavy with concern. "What's going on? Are you okay?" "No," I admitted, glancing back at the phone on the table as if the image might crawl out of it at any moment. "It's happening again. Worse this time. I saw it in my room." I heard him swear under his breath. "Stay where you are. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside felt like a warning. I couldn't bring myself to look at my phone again. Instead, I sat by the front door, gripping my keys tightly in my hand, as if ready to bolt the moment I saw anything unusual. When Mark finally arrived, I practically yanked him inside, locking the door behind him. "You need to see this," I said, leading him to the table where my phone still lay face down. "There's another photo. Of me." Mark's face went pale as I described what I had seen, but he didn't argue. He picked up the phone, opened the gallery, and scrolled to the last picture. I watched his reaction, my heart pounding. His eyes widened, and I saw the color drain from his face. "This is impossible," he muttered under his breath. "It's not just watching you now. It's..." His voice trailed off, and he shook his head, clearly at a loss for words. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Mark, tell me what to do." He looked at me, his eyes full of fear, and for the first time, I saw that he didn't have the answers. He didn't know how to stop this any more than I did. But he tried to hide it, forcing a calm tone into his voice. We need to figure out what this thing is. There has to be a reason it's appearing in these photos, a way to stop it. I wasn't sure if I believed him. The hopelessness in his eyes said otherwise. But we had no choice. We had to try. Mark sat down with my phone, going through the photos again, trying to find any detail we might have missed. Meanwhile, I paced the room, my mind racing. There had to be something connecting all these disappearances. Something we weren't seeing. And then, a thought hit me. What if the photos aren't just a warning? I asked, stopping mid-stride. What if they're a message? Mark looked up from the screen, frowning. A message? From who? Not from who, I said, my voice growing steadier as the idea took shape in my mind. From it. The photographer. Mark raised an eyebrow. You think this thing is trying to communicate? I nodded slowly, the pieces of the puzzle starting to click into place. Think about it. It's not just following random people. It's choosing them. It's making sure we see these photos. Maybe it wants us to do something. Mark didn't look convinced, but he leaned back, considering my words. So, what does it want? What could a thing like that possibly want from us? I don't know, I admitted, the dread creeping back in. But we need to figure it out fast. Because I don't think it's going to stop until it gets what it wants. Before Mark could respond, my phone buzzed. We both froze, the sound cutting through the tense silence like a knife. Slowly, I picked it up, my hands trembling. There was a new notification. One new photo added to the gallery. I opened it. It was of me and Mark, sitting in the room just as we were now. But there, standing behind us, was the photographer, clearer than ever before, almost close enough to touch. I dropped the phone as if it had burned me, the image of the photographer still etched in my mind. Mark was behind me in the picture, his face twisted in confusion, just as he was now. And behind both of us, closer than ever before, stood the shadowy figure. My stomach churned with a sickening realization. It wasn't just following me anymore. It was here, in the room with us. Mark's eyes flickered between me and the phone, his face pale as he tried to comprehend what he had just seen. What the hell is this? His voice was barely above a whisper, but I could hear the fear in it. He was a rational man, not one to believe in the supernatural. But now, reality was bending, and neither of us had any control. It's here, I managed to say, my voice trembling. It's watching us right now. Mark stood up, pacing the room in agitation. No. This isn't real. It can't be real. His denial was a thin veil over his fear. He was trying to hold on to something logical, something he could understand. But we were far beyond logic now. I didn't answer him. I was too busy scanning the room, every shadow, every dark corner suddenly feeling alive, like the photographer was lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere had shifted with the arrival of that thing. What do we do? I asked again, the question hanging heavy between us. But this time, I didn't expect an answer. There was no one to turn to, no place to hide. We were trapped in this nightmare, and the photographer had us in its sights. Mark finally stopped pacing and turned to me, his face grim. We need to get out of here. Right now, I nodded, not needing any further convincing. We grabbed our jackets, our movements hurried and frantic. As we reached the door, I hesitated, glancing back at the room. It felt like leaving wouldn't be enough. The photographer could follow us anywhere. But staying was worse. At least outside, we had a chance. We stepped into the cold night air, the city quiet around us. The streets were mostly empty, only a few people milling about in the distance. I looked up at the windows of my apartment building, half expecting to see that shadowy figure staring back at us from my window. But there was nothing. Just darkness. Where do we go? I asked, my voice shaky. Running felt futile, but standing still was unthinkable. Mark glanced around, his expression tense. We need to go somewhere crowded. Public. Somewhere it can't reach us. I wasn't sure if that would work, but it was better than staying isolated. We headed toward the city center, where the streets were brighter, filled with the hum of life and activity. As we walked, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the photographer at every turn. But there was nothing. The lights and noise of the city did little to calm my nerves. Every face we passed seemed wrong, distorted somehow. I couldn't shake the paranoia that any one of these people could be part of this. That maybe, just maybe, they could see the photographer too, but were too scared to admit it. Mark and I ended up in a small cafe, the kind that stayed open late into the night. It was filled with the warm glow of soft lights and the low murmur of conversation. For a moment, it felt safe. Normal. We sat at a table by the window, both of us silent, our minds too overwhelmed to speak. Mark was the first to break the silence. We need a plan, he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. We can't just keep running from this thing. We need to figure out what it wants. I nodded, though the truth was, I had no idea where to start. The photographer wasn't like anything I had ever encountered. It didn't seem to have a motive, or at least not one I could understand. It just watched, followed, took pictures. But why? Why me? Why now? I think it's choosing us for a reason, I said slowly, voicing the thought that had been gnawing at me. There has to be a pattern. The people in the photos, they all disappeared. But why? Mark leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. You said it might be sending a message. What kind of message? I thought back to the forum post, the warnings about the photographer. Maybe it's trying to show us something. Maybe the photos aren't just random. Maybe we're supposed to figure something out before. I didn't finish the sentence. Before we disappeared too. Mark frowned, deep in thought. What if it's not about the people in the photos, but about the places? The studio you found, it has to be connected somehow. My heart skipped a beat. The studio. The abandoned photography shop where I had found those old pictures. It was the only real clue we had, the only place that seemed tied to all of this. You think we should go back? I asked, my voice wavering. The thought of returning to that place filled me with dread, but Mark was right. We didn't have any other leads. It's dangerous, Mark said, his tone serious. But we don't have much of a choice. If we don't figure this out, we could be next. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. He was right. We couldn't run forever. We had to face the photographer, whatever it was, and find out why it had marked us. We left the cafe, the warmth of the lights and the sound of people fading behind us as we ventured back into the cold night. The city felt different now, like the photographer was lurking in every shadow, waiting for us to make our move. As we made our way back to the old photography studio, my fear grew with each step. My mind raced with thoughts of what we might find there, answers, or perhaps more questions. Either way, I knew we were getting closer to the heart of the mystery. And closer to the photographer. When we finally reached the studio, it was as I remembered it, silent, abandoned, and filled with an unsettling air of decay. The door creaked as we pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. Inside, the same dusty photographs lined the walls, the same eerie sense of being watched filled the space. But this time, something was different. There was a new photo on the table. My hand shook as I approached it, dread gnawing at my insides. I picked up the photo, holding it up to the dim light. It was a picture of me and Mark, standing right here in this studio. And behind us, in the shadows, was the photographer. But this time, it wasn't blurry. This time, it was clear. And it was smiling. Mark grabbed the photo from my hands, staring at it with wide eyes. He didn't say anything, but I could see his mind racing. The fear in the room was palpable, thick enough to choke on. We both knew that we were no longer just being followed. We were being toyed with, manipulated. The photographer was letting us know that it was always one step ahead. "We can't stay here," Mark finally muttered, his voice shaking. "This place, it's part of it. It's a trap. But where could we go?" The city, with its lights and people, had given me a fleeting sense of security, but that was gone now. The photographer could follow us anywhere. There was no place to hide. No place it couldn't reach. I shoved the photo back onto the table, my hand shaking uncontrollably. "What does it want from us? Why is it doing this?" Mark shook his head. "I don't know. But we can't keep playing its game. We need to find a way to stop it." "How?" My voice cracked, rising in panic. "How do you stop something that doesn't even seem real?" Mark didn't answer. He just stared at the photo in silence, lost in thought. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "There's only one thing we haven't tried." I looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Mark's expression hardened. "The camera. If this thing is tied to photographs, maybe the answer lies in the camera itself. It's the only connection we have to the photographer." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You think it's inside the camera? That's what's controlling it?" "I don't know," Mark admitted, "but I think it's worth a shot. If we can find the camera that took these photos, maybe we can find a way to stop this." I wanted to argue, to say that it was a long shot, that there was no guarantee it would work. But deep down, I knew that he was right. The photographer had chosen to show itself in photos for a reason. The camera had to be part of it. Maybe even the key. We searched the studio, our footsteps echoing eerily in the empty space. Dust floated in the air, disturbed for the first time in what felt like years. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart race, every shadow seemed alive with threat. But after what felt like hours, we found nothing. No camera. Just more of those haunting photos, scattered across tables and pinned to the walls. Mark cursed under his breath, frustration boiling over. "It has to be here," he muttered, slamming a fist on the table. And then, I saw it. A faint shimmer of light reflecting off something tucked away in the far corner of the room. I walked over, heart pounding, and there it was, an old, dusty camera, half buried under a pile of photographs. It looked ancient, its metal frame dull with age, and its lens cracked as if it had seen too much. "This has to be it," I whispered, my hands trembling as I reached for it. The moment my fingers brushed the cold metal, a sharp, stabbing pain shot through my head. I gasped, recoiling in shock. Mark rushed to my side, concern etched across his face. "What happened?" "I don't know," I said, rubbing my temples. It felt like something hit me, like a surge of pain. Mark frowned, eyeing the camera warily. "Maybe this thing is more dangerous than we thought." I didn't argue. My head still throbbed with a dull ache, but I forced myself to push through it. "We have to try something," I said. "This camera might be our only chance." Mark hesitated, but finally nodded. "Okay, let's do this." We took the camera outside the studio, not wanting to stay in that cursed place any longer than necessary. As soon as we were out on the street, I felt a slight relief, though the sense of being watched never fully left me. The photographer was still with us. I could feel its presence, lurking in the shadows, waiting for us to make our move. "What now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark looked down at the camera, then back at me. "We need to destroy it. If the photographer is tied to the camera, maybe breaking it will sever the connection." It was a simple plan, and maybe that's why it felt so terrifying. What if it didn't work? What if destroying the camera only made things worse? But we didn't have time for second guesses. I nodded, gripping the camera tightly, and Mark led the way to an alley nearby, far from prying eyes. "Do it," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. With a deep breath, I raised the camera high and slammed it down onto the ground. The metal cracked and splintered under the force, pieces of the lens scattering across the pavement. I didn't stop. I brought my foot down on the remains, crushing the pieces further, grinding them into dust. By the time I was done, the camera was nothing but a mangled pile of debris. For a moment, nothing happened. The world was still, silent. And then, the air around us shifted. The shadows in the alley seemed to warp, twisting unnaturally, as if reality itself was unraveling. I heard a low, guttural noise, like a distant growl, and the temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged in the air, and I felt a cold hand grip my heart. "It's not over," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's still here." Before I could respond, something moved in the shadows. A figure, tall and slender, slowly emerged from the darkness. The photographer. But this time, it wasn't just a figure in the background. It wasn't blurry or distant. It was here, fully visible, standing right in front of us. Its face, if it could be called a face, was still featureless, just a mass of darkness. But its presence was undeniable. It was real. And it was angry. I took a step back, my body frozen with fear. Mark stood beside me, his fists clenched, but I could see the terror in his eyes. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice shaking. "Why are you doing this?" The photographer didn't answer. It just stood there, silent and still, like a living shadow. And then, slowly, it raised its hand. The air around us grew heavier, suffocating, as if the photographer was pulling us into its world, into the darkness. I struggled to breathe, my vision blurring. I could feel it now, the cold, unrelenting presence of death. "Run!" Mark shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me back. But it was too late. The photographer reached out, its hand brushing against my skin. And everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold ground, the alley around me eerily quiet. Mark was gone. The photographer was gone. I was alone. The silence pressed in on me, and I realized with growing dread that something had changed. I reached for my phone, hands trembling, and opened the gallery. There, in the latest photo, was an image of me, alone, lying in that alley, just as I was now. And behind me, in the shadows, stood the photographer, smiling. The Legend of the Black Cat. Have you ever heard of the legend? They say that if you see the black cat, the one with eyes like coals burning in the night, you won't live to see another dawn. It's not the usual stray, mind you. This one comes for a purpose, silent and swift, like a shadow in the corner of your eye. It's not some folktale passed down by old wives, it's something real, something that creeps into the cracks of everyday life. And I should know, because I saw it. It began on a night like any other. The air was cold, the streets of our small town empty. I was heading home from a late shift at work, feeling the weight of exhaustion tugging at my limbs. The lamps along the pavement flickered, casting long, distorted shadows, and the occasional car passed by, breaking the eerie silence that clung to the night. I didn't believe in things like this, not really. Ghosts, curses, urban legends, they were the stuff of childhood nightmares, told around campfires to give us a thrill. But what happened that night, there's no other way to explain it. I was almost home when I saw the cat. It stood under the glow of a street lamp, its black fur blending seamlessly with the darkness surrounding it. At first, I didn't think much of it. Cats wander the streets at night all the time. But this one didn't move. It didn't even blink. It just stared at me, its yellow eyes glowing like embers in the night. There was something unsettling about the way it watched me, like it was waiting for something or someone. I felt a chill crawl down my spine, but I brushed it off. It was just a cat. Just a regular, everyday cat. But as I took a step forward, it turned its head, and that's when I noticed something strange. Its eyes didn't reflect the light like a normal cat's would. Instead, they absorbed it, drawing it into the inky darkness of its fur. The air around me suddenly felt thicker, heavier, like it was pressing down on my chest. I quickened my pace, eager to get home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. When I reached my front door, I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting the cat to be gone. But it wasn't. It was still there, standing in the same spot, its eyes locked on mine. My heart skipped a beat. Something in the pit of my stomach told me not to turn my back on it, but I couldn't stand there forever. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking slightly, and hurried inside, slamming the door behind me. For a moment, I stood there in the hallway, breathing heavily. It was just a cat, I told myself again. Nothing more. But as I looked out the window, I saw it still standing under the street lamp, watching. That was the first sign. The first warning. But I didn't know it yet. I had no idea what was coming. That night, I went to bed feeling uneasy, unable to shake the image of those burning yellow eyes from my mind. Every creak of the house made me jump, and every shadow seemed to stretch just a little too long. I hardly slept at all, tossing and turning in restless confusion. I convinced myself that it was all just my imagination running wild. After all, I was tired, worn out from a long day at work. But when morning came, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home. The next day, I went about my routine as usual. I left the house, locking the door behind me, and made my way to the office. The sun was shining, the sky a bright, cloudless blue, and the town was awake and bustling with people. It seemed silly, almost laughable, to think that I had been so spooked by a cat. But as I rounded the corner onto the main street, my stomach dropped. There, sitting on the curb, was the black cat. It looked just as it had the night before, perfectly still, watching. This time, though, there was something different. The shadows around it seemed darker, denser, as if they were swallowing the light from the street. I stopped in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, locked in a silent standoff with this creature that shouldn't have been there. Then, as if on cue, it slowly turned and disappeared into the alley beside the post office. I blinked, unsure if I had really seen it move, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. I stood frozen for a moment, torn between the urge to follow it and the overwhelming fear that told me to stay far away. But something inside me pushed me forward. Against my better judgment, I took a step toward the alley, peering into the narrow space between the buildings. The cat was gone, as if it had never been there at all. I told myself to forget about it, to go on with my day. But the feeling of being watched never left me. It clung to me like a second skin, an invisible presence that lurked just out of sight. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I expected to see those burning eyes staring back at me. By the time I got home that evening, I was on edge, my nerves frayed from a day of paranoia. I checked the windows, locked the doors, and tried to convince myself that everything was normal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The cat was just the beginning. The following nights were restless, plagued by a sense of unease I couldn't shake. Each evening, as I walked home from work, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I cared to admit. But the cat, no, that cat, didn't show itself again. Not for a few days at least. I had almost convinced myself that the whole thing was just some bizarre coincidence, a trick of my tired mind. But then came the dreams. At first, they were vague, shadows moving at the edge of my vision, a sensation of being chased through darkened streets, my feet heavy like I was wading through water. The cat was always there, lurking just beyond reach, its eyes glowing like twin stars in the blackness. One night, I woke up gasping for air, my heart racing. The darkness in my bedroom seemed heavier, thicker, as if it was pressing in on me from all sides. My skin was slick with cold sweat, and it felt like I was being watched. I fumbled for the light switch on the nightstand, flipping it on with a shaky hand. There was nothing there. Of course, there was nothing there. But the feeling lingered. I tried to convince myself that it was all just a nightmare, that I was being paranoid. I had to be. But when I got up to get a glass of water, something caught my eye. I froze, staring at the small window above the kitchen sink. There, perched on the sill outside, was the black cat. I dropped the glass. It shattered on the floor, the sound loud in the stillness of the night. But I didn't care. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the creature that had somehow found its way to my home again. It was watching me. Its eyes gleamed in the faint light from the street lamp outside, unblinking, unmoving. I stepped back slowly, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get away, but my legs felt like lead. I stood frozen in place, my pulse hammering in my ears, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Then, just as silently as it had appeared, the cat turned and vanished into the night. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty window, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was I losing my mind? It felt impossible, absurd even. But the longer I stood there, the more certain I became that it wasn't just a dream. The cat had found me again, and something told me it wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. The next day, I couldn't focus at work. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those burning yellow orbs staring through me like they could see something deep inside. My coworkers noticed my distraction, but I couldn't explain it to them. How could I? A black cat keeps following me, and I think it's trying to kill me. No one would believe that. Hell, I barely believed it myself. But something in my gut told me this was real. Too real. That evening, I stayed late at the office, not because I had extra work to do, but because I didn't want to go home. The thought of walking those empty streets again, knowing that the cat could be waiting, filled me with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. By the time I finally left, the streets were even quieter than usual. I kept my head down, my hands stuffed deep into my pockets, trying to avoid every shadow that seemed to stretch impossibly long in the dim light. Every sound, a rustling leaf, the distant hum of a car engine, made my heart jump. I walked faster, the panic rising in my chest with each step. And then I saw it. The black cat stood at the end of the street, directly in my path. It was waiting for me, its body perfectly still, except for the slow, rhythmic flick of its tail. The street lamps above it flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach out toward me. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The cat didn't move. It just watched, its eyes glowing brighter with each passing second. The world around me felt like it was collapsing, folding in on itself. The air was thick, suffocating, and for the first time, I felt real, primal fear, like prey caught in the sights of a predator. I had to get away. I had to run. But as soon as I took a step backward, the cat moved. It slunk forward, its movements fluid and unnatural, like a shadow stretching across the ground. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned and bolted, sprinting down the nearest alley, my footsteps echoing in the narrow space between the buildings. I could hear it behind me. I didn't have to look back to know it was there. The sound of its soft, padded steps was just behind me, getting closer with every heartbeat. Panic surged through me, and I pushed myself harder, faster, desperate to escape. I turned corner after corner, hoping to lose it in the maze of streets, but no matter how far I ran, I could still feel it. That presence, that suffocating darkness, was always just a step behind me. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it catch me. Not tonight. Finally, I stumbled into a small park, gasping for breath, my body trembling from exhaustion and fear. I looked around, my eyes wild, searching for any sign of the cat. But it was gone. The park was empty, the shadows long and still under the pale glow of the moon. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that I had escaped, that I had outrun it. But deep down, I knew the truth. The cat wasn't chasing me because it wanted to catch me. It was playing with me. And I was running out of time. The days blurred into one another after that night. Each morning I woke up more exhausted than the last, my mind haunted by nightmares of the black cat and the suffocating darkness that seemed to follow me everywhere. I barely ate, barely slept. Every corner I turned, I expected to see those glowing eyes waiting for me, and more often than not, I did. The cat was everywhere. At first, it only appeared at night, on my way home, outside my window, in the silent spaces where the light didn't reach. But then it began showing up during the day. I'd catch glimpses of it in the distance, sitting on the roof of a building or lurking in an alleyway, always watching, always waiting. It felt like the walls were closing in. I couldn't escape it. I started avoiding my usual routes, taking longer ways home just to lose the cat, but it didn't matter. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, the cat found me. It was like it could sense my fear, like it thrived on it. And with each encounter, the dread in my chest grew heavier, the air around me thicker, harder to breathe. One afternoon, I tried to tell a friend about what was happening. I thought maybe if I said it out loud, it would make more sense, or at least help me feel less insane. "Hey, I've noticed this weird cat following me," I started, trying to sound casual. My friend, Mark, glanced up from his phone, raising an eyebrow. "A cat? Seriously?" He chuckled, clearly not taking me seriously. "Dude, it's just a stray. You're overthinking this." "I don't think it's just a stray." The words came out before I could stop them. "It's different. It's always there, Mark. Every day. And when I see it, it's like I can't breathe. Like it's not just watching me. It's waiting for something." Mark laughed again, louder this time. "Come on, man. It's a cat. They're all creepy. It's probably just following you because you smell like food or something." I didn't respond. How could I explain the growing terror that gnawed at the edges of my sanity? How could I make him understand that it wasn't just a cat, that this thing, this entity, was hunting me? I couldn't. So, I gave up trying. Mark's laughter echoed in my ears as I left. But as soon as I stepped outside, the laughter died, replaced by a suffocating silence. And then I saw it again. The black cat sat across the street, its gaze locked on me. It didn't move. It didn't blink. It just watched. I turned and walked away, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. Mark didn't believe me. No one would. I was completely alone in this nightmare. That night, things got worse. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying desperately to calm the racing thoughts in my mind. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight, but I could still feel the oppressive weight of something outside. My pulse quickened, and I rolled over, facing the window. For a moment, nothing happened. The street outside was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of a car engine passing by. And then, I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a barely perceptible movement in the corner of my eye. But as I focused, I realized that the cat was there again, sitting on the ledge of the fence in my backyard, its eyes burning bright through the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest, and I pulled the blanket tighter around me, as if that flimsy barrier could somehow protect me from the growing terror. I tried to convince myself that it couldn't get inside, that I was safe behind locked doors and windows. But deep down, I knew it didn't need to get inside. It was already inside my mind. It had burrowed deep into my thoughts, feeding off my fear, slowly driving me to the edge. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the image of the cat. But even with my eyes closed, I could still feel its gaze, like icy fingers crawling up my spine. I don't know how long I lay there, trapped in a suffocating grip of terror, but at some point, I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, the room was cold. Too cold. A strange, heavy stillness hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't move. I didn't want to open my eyes, didn't want to see what was waiting for me in the darkness. But something felt wrong, more wrong than usual. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my pulse quickened. Slowly, I cracked my eyes open. The cat was inside. It stood at the foot of my bed, its dark silhouette barely visible in the dim light filtering through the curtains. My breath hitched in my throat as I stared at it, frozen in place. It didn't move. It didn't blink. It just watched me, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, and for the first time, I felt a cold, creeping certainty settle over me. This was it. I couldn't escape anymore. The cat had come for me. I don't know how long we stayed like that, locked in a silent standoff, but eventually, something inside me snapped. My body moved before my mind could catch up, and I bolted out of bed, stumbling toward the door. I had to get out. I had to get away. But as soon as my hand touched the doorknob, I felt it, a cold, wet sensation on the back of my neck. I froze, my heart stopping in my chest, and slowly turned around. The cat was standing right behind me. It was so close that I could feel its breath on my skin, see the dark gleam in its eyes as it stared up at me. My legs gave out, and I collapsed to the floor, trembling, unable to move or scream. It didn't attack me. It didn't need to. The terror it instilled in me was enough. I lay there, shivering in the dark, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. The cat stood over me for what felt like an eternity, its eyes glowing brighter and brighter, until everything around me dissolved into darkness. I don't remember much about what happened after that night. Days passed in a blur, and I could no longer tell what was real and what wasn't. The line between waking and dreaming had become impossibly thin, and I drifted between the two, never fully awake but never fully asleep either. The cat had claimed me. It didn't need to follow me anymore. Now it lived inside me, deep in my mind, curling itself into every dark corner, every thought, every fear. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. Each night, the dreams became worse. I found myself trapped in a labyrinth of shadows, endlessly running but never escaping. The streets twisted and turned, warping into impossible angles, and no matter where I went, the cat was always there, waiting at the end of each path, its eyes glowing like two yellow suns. I would wake up gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, my pulse racing. But even in the daylight, the feeling of dread never left me. The cat was always with me now. I could sense it, lurking in the corners of my vision, just out of sight, but always there. I tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. I went to work, talked to my coworkers, smiled while I was supposed to, but every conversation felt hollow, every smile forced. My thoughts were consumed by the cat, by the inevitability of what was coming. I was living on borrowed time, and I knew it. One afternoon, as I sat at my desk, staring blankly at my computer screen, Mark appeared beside me. He gave me a concerned look, his usual grin replaced by a frown. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, sitting down in the chair next to me. "You've been acting different lately." I wanted to tell him the truth, to explain everything that had been happening, the dreams, the cat, the creeping sense of doom that hung over me like a dark cloud. But the words stuck in my throat. What could I say? That I was being haunted by a creature that no one else could see? That every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was being dragged deeper into some endless void? He wouldn't believe me. No one would. So, I just nodded, forcing a smile that felt more like a grimace. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired." Mark didn't look convinced, but he didn't push it. Alright, well, let me know if you need anything, okay? I'm here if you want to talk. I thanked him, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Talking wouldn't change anything. Nothing would. The cat had made sure of that. That night, I didn't go home right away. Instead, I wandered the city streets, trying to clear my mind, trying to figure out what to do next. But no matter how far I walked, the feeling of being watched never left me. It clung to me like a second skin, suffocating, inescapable. Eventually, I found myself in a small, rundown bar on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place that didn't ask questions, where people went to disappear for a few hours. I sat at the counter, nursing a drink, staring at my reflection in the cracked mirror behind the bar. I barely recognized myself. The dark circles under my eyes, the hollow look in my face, it was like I was looking at a stranger. The person I used to be was gone, replaced by someone who was constantly on the edge of panic, someone who couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think without feeling that familiar, creeping dread. And then, in the reflection, I saw it. The cat. It was sitting on the bar stool beside me, its black fur sleek and perfect, its yellow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. My heart seized in my chest, and I turned to look, but the stool was empty. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, trying to convince myself that it was just another hallucination, just my sleep-deprived mind playing tricks on me. But when I looked back at the mirror, the cat was still there. Closer this time. Its reflection was wrong, distorted, like it didn't belong in the world around it. The edges of its body blurred into the shadows, and its eyes, those horrible, glowing eyes, seemed to bore into me, peeling away every layer of my mind until all that was left was raw, naked fear. I stumbled out of the bar, my heart racing, my mind spinning. The world around me felt warped, unreal, like I was walking through a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away, as far away as possible. But deep down, I knew there was nowhere to run. The cat would find me. It always did. I found myself back at my apartment hours later, exhausted, broken. I locked the door behind me, leaned against it, and slid down to the floor, burying my face in my hands. My body trembled uncontrollably, and the cold, gnawing fear that had been growing inside me for weeks finally reached its breaking point. I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't keep running, couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. I had to confront it. Whatever it was, whatever this thing wanted, I had to face it. Because if I didn't, it would never stop. It would haunt me forever, dragging me deeper and deeper into madness until there was nothing left of me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, staring out into the darkness, waiting. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I knew that the cat would come for me. It always did. And, as the hours stretched into the early morning, I saw it. The cat was standing at the edge of my yard, its yellow eyes glowing faintly in the pale light of dawn. It didn't move. It just watched me, its tail flicking back and forth slowly, deliberately. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This was it. No more running. No more hiding. I stood up from the chair, my legs weak and trembling, and made my way to the door. My heart pounded in my chest, a rhythmic reminder that I was still alive, for now. The cat was waiting for me outside. I knew that much. But what I didn't know was how this would end. Would I survive this encounter? Or was this the moment I had been dreading for weeks, the moment when everything would finally fall apart? My fingers fumbled with the lock, the cold metal biting into my skin as I turned the key. The door creaked open, and the chill of the early morning air hit me, sharp and biting. The world outside was quiet, too quiet, as if it was holding its breath in anticipation. And there it was. The black cat stood in the center of the yard, its eyes locked on mine. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just watched me, waiting. The air around it seemed to shimmer, like a heat wave rising from the ground, distorting its form. For a moment, I thought I could see something else, something darker, lurking just beneath the surface of the cat's sleek black fur. I stepped outside, my bare feet sinking into the cold, damp grass. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them coherent. I was scared, more scared than I had ever been in my life. But I couldn't turn back now. This was the end, one way or another. Slowly, I walked toward the cat, each step heavy with dread. The closer I got, the more I could feel its presence, an overwhelming, suffocating force that seemed to wrap itself around me, squeezing the air from my lungs. My heart raced faster, my skin prickling with cold sweat. I wanted to stop, to run back inside and lock the door, but my body wouldn't let me. It was as if something was pulling me forward, drawing me closer to the cat. When I was only a few feet away, I stopped. The cat's eyes seemed to glow brighter, burning into me, seeing through me, stripping me down to my very core. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could I say? What could I possibly say to this thing, this creature that had haunted me for weeks, driven me to the edge of madness? For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, locked in a silent standoff. The air around us was thick with tension, so heavy that it pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. And then, the cat moved. It took one slow, deliberate step toward me, its body low to the ground, its tail flicking back and forth like a predator preparing to strike. My heart leaped into my throat, and I stumbled backward, my feet tangling in the grass. But it didn't attack. Instead, it stopped just inches away from me, its face mere inches from mine. For the first time, I could see it up close, really see it. The black fur, the sharp, angular features, the glowing yellow eyes. But there was something else, too. Something that made my blood run cold. The cat's eyes were not just glowing, they were empty, hollow, like two dark voids that stretched on forever. And in those eyes, I saw something that made my stomach churn. I saw myself. I don't know how to explain it, but in that moment, as I stared into the cat's eyes, I saw my own reflection. But it wasn't just a reflection of my physical self, it was something deeper. I saw every fear I had ever had, every doubt, every regret. I saw the version of myself that I had tried so hard to hide from the world, the weak, scared, broken version. And then, the cat spoke. Not with words, not in any way that I could explain, but I heard it, clear as day, in my mind. A voice, low and cold, seeping into my thoughts like poison. You know what you must do. The words echoed in my skull, bouncing around in the empty space where my sanity used to be. I shook my head, stumbling back again, my hands trembling. No, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I don't understand. The cat's eyes glowed brighter, and the pressure in my chest grew unbearable. It took another step toward me, its cold, wet nose brushing against my hand. My skin crawled at the contact, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, trapped in the cat's gaze. You cannot run from it. You cannot hide. The words were louder now, more insistent. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the fear was too overwhelming. I could feel myself unraveling, my grip on reality slipping through my fingers. The cat's gaze never wavered, never blinked. It was as if it was waiting for something, for me to understand, to accept. And then it hit me. This whole time, I had been running from the cat, from the fear, from the inevitable. But I couldn't outrun it. No one could. This wasn't about the cat. It had never been about the cat. It was about me. The cat wasn't a predator. It wasn't hunting me. It was showing me the truth. I had been running from my own fear, my own darkness, for as long as I could remember. But now, standing here, face to face with this creature, I couldn't run anymore. The truth was staring me in the face. I fell to my knees, the weight of the realization crashing down on me like a tidal wave. Tears streamed down my face, and I could feel the last remnants of my sanity slipping away. The cat moved closer, its cold body pressing against mine, and I felt a strange, sickening sense of peace wash over me. This was it. The end. Accept it, the voice whispered, and I knew that I had no choice. With trembling hands, I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cat's fur. The moment I touched it, the world around me dissolved. The darkness closed in, swallowing everything, my thoughts, my fears, my very existence. And then, there was nothing. When they found me the next morning, I was still on my knees in the yard, my eyes wide open, staring into the void. But I was gone. The cat had taken me. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.